Hello and welcome. My name is Father William Maestri, and this is Overfed and Undernourished. The topic once again is religious freedom. This is part 8 of our special 10-part series on the topic of religious freedom. And we're going to shift focus in this particular episode. We're going to turn from the issue of religious liberty as it affects the United States, in other words, the domestic face of religious liberty, and we're going to look internationally to see at what the world situation is in various countries related to the important fundamental human right, which was recognized even by the United Nations in its Declaration on Human Rights, as the right to worship, the right to assembly, and to worship God in accordance with one's conscience and one's fundamental religious beliefs. And so we want to shift again the focus to the international scene. But to set the stage, we ought to keep a couple of things in mind. Number one is that in October of 1998, President of the United States, Bill Clinton, signed the International Religious Freedom Act, and with it was established the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And part of this act, and subsequently followed from this act, is that each and every year the State Department is required to submit a report to the Congress and to the Secretary of State on the conditions of religious liberty throughout the world, especially in those countries where we have ongoing economic, political, and even military cooperation and various kinds of understandings that take place. And not to be lost is the importance of religious liberty as, in the United States, our first liberty, as we saw in our discussion of the Bill of Rights, the non-establishment clause and the free exercise component of that first of rights, the right to worship, as one's conscience dictates. And so we want to turn our focus to the international area. And it would be good if people would take time to read these reports. We have the 2020 report is out, as well as the 2019 report. And those reports were delivered by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who oversees the entire State Department and this particular and important component of the State Department. In fact, President Trump signed a $50 million added part of the budget in order to monitor and to see that religious rights were being respected in various parts of the world, especially in those countries where the United States has interest and ongoing relations. The current director of the Office of International Religious Freedom is the former Kansas governor and United States Senator Sam Brownback. And he is the one who directs and has the official title of ambassador. And he gives regular reports to the Secretary of State, as well as to various reports to Congress and to the President as they may be needed. Now, the situation in the rest of the world, we'll get to the United States in a moment because they're not exempt from some of these concerns, to be sure. But the report is somewhat bleak, frankly, in recent years. And this may come as a surprise to many people because we take for granted the religious liberty that we have, the pluralism, the right to worship, various other kinds of liberties that we have guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. We tend to take that for granted and believe, well, that's the way everybody around the world conducts business. And of course, at some level, we know that that really is not true, that in fact, some regimes, and we'll name them in a moment, Some regimes are so oppressive that it's a common practice for murder, torture, false imprisonment, camps that hold so-called religious prisoners as enemies of the state, those who are putting out information that disrupts the society and the tranquility of the society. And often there are a large number of show trials that take place to give the appearance to the rest of the world that this is really just and this is fair and everyone's rights are being respected. And yet we know on closer examination nothing could be further from the truth. And I'm going to go through some of the more familiar ones with you, especially those that have ongoing relationships with the United States and some that do not. And these are classified as nations of particular concern, the category of particular concern. And within this category of particular concern, there are various tiers, 1, 2, and 3, of concern. But the actors that are of particular concern and are very closely watched by the State Department and monitored by the United States include, and I'll look at my William F. Buckley Jr. Clipboard to make sure that I get them named here. And some of you, no doubt, would not be surprised by the particular nations that are really in violation of basic rights, although they sign these Declaration of Rights that come out of the UN, these international accords. They sign them, but we realize that the actual application is far, far from the reality that takes place in those particular countries. Iran is particularly hostile to Christians, and obviously they do not allow any kind of pluralism of religion, and those particular sects or those particular branches of a religion, they may be persecuted because they do not agree with the official religion, which is really a theocracy. The state is really a theocracy run by the mullahs. And there are imprisonments, there's torture, there's banishment, there's even internment camps which lead eventually to execution of what are called destabilizing forces within the state. Russia is particularly hard on Jehovah's Witnesses because of the witnesses' evangelical outreach and evangelization of proselytizing with Bibles, pamphlets, face-to-face contact, a great deal of restrictions in Russia. Also in China. China recognizes only one religion. It's the religion of the supremacy of the state. It's a state religion because religion is the state and the state is the religion, and in effect, the state is God. And the leaders are emissaries, if you want, functionaries of carrying out what God would intend. The God, of course, with a small g, and a God referring to the political reality or the political power structure that's in place, namely communist China. North Korea is such a closed and isolated nation, but religion is severely persecuted in North Korea, as you might expect. Again, the state reigns supreme, and the leader, the despot or the tyrant, the dictator, who is in charge, is treated practically on the level of a god. We also have other places like Nigeria and Syria. there's often a great deal of tribal and religious difficulties and persecutions that take place in various regions. Saudi Arabia is very, very severe in its crackdown on any kind of pluralism or any kind of openness to various religious expressions that do not conform to the orthodoxy proposed by the ruling families of Saudi Arabia, which again is troubling because Saudi Arabia is a quote-unquote close ally of the United States, both militarily as well as economically, and is often seen as a stabilizing force in the Arab world, especially in its contentious relationships in the Middle East with Israel. Syria also is on the nation of particular concern. Assad, its dictator, is again very much involved in the Shiites and the Sunnis back and forth that takes place there, and is highly repressive to the point of torture and death as well. In the Northern Hemisphere, we have Cuba, Guatemala, and Nicaragua that are very repressive when it comes to religion. Religion often is very tightly controlled or outlawed altogether, with the military and police involved in state crackdowns and state punishment, imprisonment, phony trials, and torture that takes place in these particular countries. And the religious persecution internationally involves Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and we'll say a special word about Jews, and all of those as we move back to the American context, because we don't want to, while this is an international discussion, we also have to be aware that in the North American continent and here in the United States, there have been cases of religious violence and discrimination against Christians, Jews, and Muslims as well. And we see that in the United States, which has been very troubling, given the importance that liberty and religious liberty has enjoyed and holds a cherished place in our own political and historical experience. We have seen in recent years an increase in the number of religious attacks that have taken place on religious places of worship, institutions, assemblies that have taken place. Christian churches are often attacked. They are the subject of graffiti and various other kinds of desecrations that take place. This is especially true of black churches, where the historical black church, various congregations, have either been firebombed or those who attend are the subject of violence and harassment. And this has picked up in recent years. Muslim mosques have also been the subject of attacks and violence that has taken place in this country, all of which have been by officials condemned, by the way. We do not, obviously, in this country, condone officially, and the vast overwhelming majority of Americans do not support the attack and violence on houses of worship. Of special concern is the growing number of anti-Semitic attacks on the Jewish people. Synagogues and temple and places of worship and assembly, that particular rate has increased over the last several years. And that's here in our own country, the United States, and even in the North American continent and in Western Europe, by the way. There is a growing movement to suppress religion, wrapped in the idea of limiting what has been termed hate speech. Now, hate speech has come to mean, if I don't agree with you on a political or a what in the minds of religionists is a moral issue, I can be charged with, I can be imprisoned, I can be fined, I can even be closed down for hate speech. For example, if my religious tradition and my religious beliefs do not condone so-called same-sex marriage, and if I speak out that marriage is between one man and one woman, it's a sacrament instituted by God, entrusted to the church or to a religious body to perform, that can be deemed hate speech. And people can indeed suffer severe governmental and civil penalties. In some places, such as in Canada and parts of Europe, sermons, messages by priests, pastors, preachers, what have you, from the pulpit or from their assemblies and places of worship can be monitored. And the text can be confiscated, and they can be filmed. And these particular people working for the government make these reports and send them in addition to sending people from the government into the church to monitor this kind of worship, of which the sermon or the homily, what have you, the message, can be scrutinized for hate speech. This was tried briefly. The idea was floated. It was not really tried. It was floated that this would take place in the United States. Well, there was a tremendous backlash against this. So almost immediately the idea was dropped. But the mere thought that that would even be considered in the country where in the Constitution the first liberty is that of non-establishment, but also the free exercise. And the free exercise means freedom of worship and also freedom of speech and of thought. And to label that because a church has a particular doctrine or belief that perhaps the particular group of politicians who are in charge find offensive or they don't agree with, and labeling that and the ability to shut that down is indeed quite troubling. And so we are not in the West and also in our own country exempt from these kinds of impulses or movements to restrict assembly, to restrict freedom of speech, freedom of worship, even within our own particular country. And I'm often reminded of the phrase that, or the sentence, or the sentiment of President Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan said that the loss of liberty is but a generation away. It's always a generation away, because freedom is not a once and for all thing. Once, that's it, it's for all and forever. It must be won anew every day. Every day in the decisions that we make, in the decision that our governmental officials make. And one of the worst things that could happen is that we take that liberty, whether it be speech, assembly, worship, what have you. Once we take that for granted, it is a little less than a generation away from being lost. And once freedom is lost, it is very, very difficult to gain it back again. And so that was a concern of the founders, certainly, which is why they injected and passed the Bill of Rights, because of the fear of the overreach of government, the intrusion of government in those areas where government had no competence and really had no business trampling on or interfering with the natural rights of all human beings, one of which was, of course, religious freedom. So the question arises, what can we do? It seems so awesome to talk about international religious freedom, even to talk about freedom maybe in our own state, our own communities, our own country. It seems so overwhelming. Well, there are things we can do, and really I think we are called to do. First and foremost, we're called to pray. Now immediately that's dismissed by a lot of people as ineffective, a waste of time. We should be rushing to the barricades. Well, I again believe that more good and more change has been done by prayer than all of the laws and all of the statements and all of the edicts that come out. Because if you don't have effective implementation, if you don't have that will to make this important, is religious liberty nationally and internationally as important as any economic and political and military agreement we have? Is it really? And does it receive the same attention and scrutiny and support as these other important things have in the national consciousness and in the national agenda? I'll leave you to decide that. But those things are paper. They're paper. They're important. But it's the execution and the implementation that is very important. And that requires, often in many places, a change of mind and heart. It requires a change of the will and of priorities. And that is only possible through the grace of Almighty God. God changing minds and hearts. We need to cooperate. We need to be open to that. But we need to change the minds and hearts of people who believe that religious liberty is not an important part, is not a human right, is not a fundamental natural right. And prayer, the power of prayer, the importance of prayer, is very, very crucial, especially to families who suffer so much because their loved ones live in captive nations. It's important to the people who are in the captive nations, especially those who are suffering directly, to know that they are not alone, that there are fellow believers who are praying for them, who are supporting them as best they can. And heaven has its reasons that the earth knows nothing about, but indeed brings about by the grace of God. And so prayer might seem to be useless to the practical, pragmatic mind of the modern person, but it is most effective and most important, because when any one person loses their freedom or is dehumanized, humanity suffers. All of us in some way are lessened and wounded by that. Secondly, we need to be informed. Take time to read these international reports. Read the one this year from 2020, the one from last year, 2019, on the situation and the condition internationally of religious freedom, and also here in the United States, domestically, and in the Northern Hemisphere. We have to be informed. Information is very important for productive action, action that will indeed produce results. Then we have to let our political and governmental leaders know that this is an important issue to us, that there is a constituency who believes that religious liberty is central to the human person and to the moral well-being and the common good of the society in which we live. And there may come a time in which we have to assemble, a time in which we have to peaceably gather to make our collective voices known. This also is a fundamental right, always with order and peace, and that is the way that we productively arrive at change. That's the way we productively arrive at change. And we may have to take steps. Some of us are good at prayer. Some of us may not be the activist kind of person, but we can write letters or make phone calls. Whatever our particular calling is, whatever our particular time and talent and circumstance allows, we can be a voice. We can be a voice for the importance of religious freedom. Again, just a generation away. And wouldn't that be a terrible, terrible thing to lose? Because religious freedom is so precious. Because as we know, it is so rare and it is so fragile. May it be that precious, rare, and fragile gift that we pass on to those who come after us.